I'm Henrik. I have a studio in London called A2 with Scott Williams. We set up our studio in 2000, so we've been running for 17 years, and I draw fonts. Today, I just need my notes. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Moscow Metro and the work we did for this this project. It's a very large program with a lot of people involved in many different ways, and I'll do my best to credit everyone as I go on. For the sake of clarity, I have structured my presentation as a book with chapters. So this is what we're going to go through, and hopefully in 20 minutes' time we'll be done. So the initial commission was to design a custom font for Moscow Metro for signs. With that was also the project of designing associated pictogram system that would convey Moscow's heritage and its values. And the core of this project was that the font should contain two scripts, Cyrillic and Latin. And the whole project was commissioned by CTID, who's based in just outside London. They're also based in New York now, and Moscow Department of Transport, DOT. Our team was Scott Williams, my design partner, myself, and Margaret Calvert, which was mentioned by Michael in the introduction as our consultant. And for the Cyrillic type, we used Ilya Ruderman as our co-designer and consultant. So before I start showing you all the research and we start talking about Moscow Metro, it's like before we were brought into this project, already a lot of work had been done by CDID and the Department of Transport in Moscow, and it's work like mapping the metro, now here's a long word, I made it up, but it makes sense, people, flow, and navigation diagrams. So basically on the understanding of how people navigate the metro, including identifying key areas of where signs and directional products would be placed. Now for all this, let's call it preparatory work, that was used, they used Helvetica for the design. Now we all know that Helvetica it's a beautiful typeface, but it's not the right font for Moscow Metro. So when they decided to commission this bespoke item of the project, that's when we were brought in. So Moscow Metro, it opened in 1935 with an 11-kilometer line and 13 stations. Today, it's got 206 stations, and it's almost 340 kilometers. If you haven't been there, it's go. It's extraordinary. The old stations look like this. They're like palaces on the ground. It's extraordinary. It's marble, it's chandeliers, it's gold, silver, bronzes. It's just crazy. It's so beautiful. And the new stations are beautiful in their own right. They're slightly more modernist, but there's a whole world on the ground in Moscow, and that's where we got to work. This was one of the existing signs, and it's very beautiful. I like the colors a lot, but I can't read it. Here's another version, a slightly more modern version. Again, it's beautiful, but I can't read it. The main objective of the scheme that they started in Moscow and that we were employed to help them with was that the whole signing scheme would be dual language. So it would be in Cyrillic for the locals, and then it would also be in Latin, in English, for all the visitors. This image shows us pretty much the typographic. This was the state of type. It was there's a lot going on. There was no consistency. So now I'm going to show you the research, or some of the research. It's a very large process that I've been trying to condense into 20 minutes. So you won't see everything, but I tried to include as much as I possibly could. The next thing we'll see is is a video, and apologies in advance, there's a lot of flashing images, so I'm gonna play it and then I'll talk after this, but this is what we experienced when we got there. So here we go. Here we go. That's about 490 odd images. Now I'm going to show you our design process. Out of all these images and impressions that were made on us, not just from the metro itself, but also the city, we edited the whole thing, and we identified key visuals that we could use as a starting point for fonts for this system. And we have three. We have a historical model, we have a geometric model, and then we have the more vernacular. And I'm going to just show you some of the images that relate to those type directions. So here's the historical and more calligraphic model, and it was quite clear, and we all knew that this was never a contender for the final design scheme, but nevertheless it was something we were asked to look at, and it is indeed a very beautiful and detailed, but it's also archaic in terms of signing Moscow. But it was done as part of the process. This is showing some of the geometry there is indeed in a lot of the architecture, not just in the underground, but also in the city. And what we also found was that there was a huge amount of geometry in some of the fonts used, or typefaces, lettering, the Futura-ish styles. We also have some, as you see in the top right-hand corner, some Art Deco, which is just extraordinary. But again, these are used as loose references for us crafting fonts. Here's an example of me using my regular font and kind of customizing it to see if there's something in there for the sake of arriving at something bespoke for Moscow Metro. So this is design process images. I know it looks final, but it's not. So I drew Cyrillic for all these fonts just to see how it would work. Here's another style of fonts we identified in the Metro, which is let's call it the vernacular, commonly accepted condensed font. And I just have a note. It's kind of been advocated by many design experts over the years that if you do signage, you need a condensed font. Well, that's very well, and it will save you a lot of space on a sign if you have long names. But it's actually wrong, because if you approach a sign not straight on, but from a slight angle, you can't read a condensed font. All you see is like signposts. So that's something we knew this was certainly not the way. Nevertheless, we designed this option just to make sure we covered all ground and we had enough to look at. So it's very much a case of ruling things out. There's another type of imagery we source or we discover, which is the font used on all the trains to number all the trains. Is these geometric and crude letters. They're actually very beautiful, and I drew them up. And what we'll see later on in this presentation, this is actually the starting point for one of the two fonts we decided to bring on to the next stage. So for many, just keeping track of my notes here. So for many months, our studio looked like this. it was like, and it was completely closed. No one were getting in. And so every day I went to work, it was like going to Moscow. It was wild, and it was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of pressure from all sides, from the commissioner and the project itself, and Moscow indeed also. But a huge challenge. Now, this is where I'm going to talk about our collaboration. Early on, I mentioned that Margaret Calvert was our consultant. Margaret taught me at the Royal College of Art in 98 to 2000, and we have since, both Scott in my studio and myself, stayed friends with her, and I have personally collaborated with Margaret on many of her fonts and projects. This is Margaret and myself. Margaret has also, her work is, she designed the famous transport alphabet for all the UK motorway signs with Jock Kinnear back in the 50s. It's still in use, and it's absolutely beautiful. She also designed lots of pictograms, so it was a no-brainer to use this incredible person as our kind of anchor in this whole process. So I'm just going to show you a couple of shots from when Margaret consulted us on many different stages of this project, from early on to the very end. And here she is with Scott looking at the stuff in the studio. So we were actually not supplied with any. So our job was to supply the fonts and the pictograms, but not to do any signage, not to design anything as such. That was all done by City ID. So I'm just going to go one slide back. So basically what we did our own kind of, let's say, typographic specimens to proof the fonts and see and determine how they work. So in terms of typographic hierarchy and font styles and weights and what have we. And this is just for the train spotters behind the scenes. Yes, I use RoboFont for all my font work. I use a lot of other programs, but this is my main program. This is just showing you some of the details of how I constructed the fonts. So out of this huge project of trying lots of different types and styles, we came down to two. We came down to this one, which we call Moscow Sans, and then we did this one, which we call the train font. Now, these are two very different fonts. They're both sans serif, but they're very different. Part of the process was to compare the fonts that we arrived at with existing fonts. So this is a case of where the train font has been overlaid with the DIN font. And why do we do this? Well, we did this to show the client that we were indeed crafting new fonts. We were not using existing fonts. Of course, they relate. A font is a font, but it's also a new font. So that was very important for us, but also very important for the client. They wanted something new. They wanted something they could own. This is the Sans, the Moscow Sans version of the font that's overlaid with Futura, which is a font that they, to some extent, use over there also. So we now had two fonts, and there were arguments for both fonts to be used as the main, or go on to the next and final stage. And CDID, who were the commissioner and designers in terms of designing a system, they did a very crude but very effective test, which we can see here. I'm just going to show you a couple of slides, but they basically overlaid the two fonts. On the right, we have the train font, and on the left, we have the Moscow Sans. And I know this is crude, but it gave us some information that was very important. It basically showed us that the font on the left, this one here, kind of had a natural and right feel, whereas the other one didn't quite work. So that was decided, and after a lot of we always knew there was going to be more than one font style or font weight. There's going to be a few. So after a lot of like, can you make it a little bit thicker and a little bit thinner, I did this font matrix, and I basically did 16 variations, and I said, now pick the ones you need, and that's what they did. They actually picked fonts between the two red ones, but so all along we'd been working on the pictograms also, but now we could really start working on that. And these are Scott from the studio was very much in charge of this. I did sketches also, but these are his. And again, Margaret was consulted. There we are. So now I'm going to show you the result. And just to sum the whole thing up, it's Moscow Sans. It's a custom font in 4 weights, plus a set of unique pictograms created exclusively and owned by Moscow Department of Transport. It was art directed and designed by Scott and myself, with Margaret Calvert as the type and pictogram consultant, and the Cyrillic script was designed in collaboration with Ilya Ruderman. It was all commissioned by City ID and Moscow Department of Transport. Now that's everyone credited. I've been speaking a little bit about Ilya. Ilya is in the middle, and this is one of our meetings with him in Moscow. Now, so very early on, the client asked us to said, we have this M that shows you when to where the stations are, and we want you to put this into the typeface. And I was like, it's not going to work. So, but I can do something else. I can do a sans serif version of it, and that's essentially what I did. And what that does, it doesn't. It's not like it's not the logo, but it's something when you see the font, you're familiar with some of the shapes, and one of the shapes is the M, and that is certainly something that makes your brain reference back to the metro. So you know you're in the system. It's so here's some of the core design shapes and angles that runs through the font. It's highly systemized, and this is the two scripts. This is the Cyrillic and the Latin. And what I did, Cyrillic is a very square script. There's a lot of geometry in the Cyrillic, and the Latin is very round. There's a lot of round shapes. So what I did to get the two scripts to work as a whole, I put some of the round shapes into the Cyrillic and some of the square shapes into the Latin. And what we have here is a kind of a unified font. It is one visual. We did the numbers, of course. This is a close-up of some of the pictograms. And this is the full set. We did 41 of these, and then the numbers, of course, so it ends up with 50 odd. And after me presenting the final presentation in Moscow to a very large, I don't require complete silence from you, but after presenting in Moscow, there was complete silence. I think there was like 15 people in the meeting. It was complete silence. And the main person on the client side, he said 3 words. It feels Moscow. Right. So those are very important words for us as designers, but it's also very important for the project as a whole, because it was never our intention to storm in and just give them another European typeface because that's how we do things. That's not actually how we work. So through research and through hard graft, we actually got that, and we created something that they felt came from them, which was, I'm very proud of that. So now I'm going to show you how it was implemented, and I can see on my time I'm going to run 1 minute over, so apologies to Paula and Michael. I know they're very precise, the timing. So City ID did some beautiful maps, and again, just to emphasize our role, we only delivered the font and the pictograms. We didn't do any of the design, but they did these beautiful things, including the very amazing line work of buildings. This is in the metro. Billings Jackson was the product design company doing these signs. We call them products. This is how it looks. Some of these are in progress You can still see the screws in this, but they're being taken out and fitted with proper signs. It's a very clean system, and the great news is that you can actually navigate it now because it's in English also. So they're rolling it out at speed, and they're rolling it out not just underground. They're also taking the scheme above ground. So this is the M I read through. They're also taking it onto the bus network. These are very large products that, again, we have the geometry, the round shape. By entry points to stations they are placed. So that's the core of the project. Since then, there's been additional work that we've done, and I thought I'd just show that because the project is ongoing, which is brilliant. So we've done a lot of templates and directions for how they do their documents. So anything from grid systems to point sizes to column widths. That's what we supply to them. Our studio, and what we also been doing is that we've been kind of adding to the font. So there's font sets for specific usage. So there's one for the signs, there's one when you work with text documents, there's one if you compose or design timetables, and there's indeed the web fonts. And we can see there's on the Moscow Sans text, I've done a lighter version for them. I'm currently working on a thin weight also. And this is a little bit technical, but I'm really running out. I'm so sorry. So I'm almost so the pink is me adding. They asked for small caps for the fonts, for the text fonts, which I did. And anyone drawing fonts knows that you don't just click a button; you actually draw the small caps, which I did. The green bits are the pictograms that's put into the typeface, so you can type with the pictograms and layer them in colors, which makes speed things up a lot. And this is my final couple of slides. This is where we are right now. We didn't design this, but this is what we are working on. So all the live signs, dot matrix fonts, is what we're working on now. So we're basically taking the printed fonts and turning that into this crude language of dot matrix fonts, and you can see we work with various dot sizes and weights. And that translates into the pictograms also. Some of these are going to be animated, which I'm very excited about. And this is my last slide. All this dot matrix stuff is a very exciting development, and we have great hopes that this will add even more clarity and legibility to the whole system, and hopefully making it easier to use for all generations across all nations. And as they say in Russia, spasiba, thank you.
I think Henrik can sit here.
I'm in the middle?
You're in the middle.
I'm in the middle.
Henrik, I have a question. How hard is it to know if your work is legible if you don't know the language and it's an unfamiliar alphabet?
How hard is it? That's why we worked with the Russians. That's why we had a Cyrillic expert.
But indeed, but I mean, isn't it? That degree, does that degree of separation add? Does it make it more difficult for you? You just can't look at it and tell yourself.
Well, the thing about the drawing Cyrillic is that it's actually very close to the Latins, and if you compare the glyphs or the letters like for like, there's only about 5 letters that's completely different. So they're very closely related. So in terms of designing the script, it's not Arabic, which I would never try my hand on. It's very close to where we are already, and we just ensured that everything was the way it should be by working and using the knowledge of Ilya and of course the whole Russian team.
I would like to just ask about the notion of the recognizability, the typography, and the importance of it in relationship to City ID. That, for those of you who don't know, City ID does systems all over the world.
They did New York, for
They
instance.
did New York. They look very similar. The components are similar. They had a kit of parts, and they professionalized rolling out a city, which is good if you're trying to get around the city because you know where to look, and bad if the city's going to have any form of identity. How long do you think it's going to take the public to actually absorb how they recognize your font? Like the way you immediately recognize the London Underground, or the way you immediately understand a place by its typeface. Is there an actual given period of time that it takes a user to go, oh, I'm in Moscow, I know that font? You know, is there that moment that they get it?
I don't know. I mean, it's. I think it feels Moscow. I think it's right. I think it's a combination of the work we did, and it's all in the detail. But it's also about how it's being rolled out and the sophistication of that. I think you would know when you're in Russia, and I mean the whole objective of the signing scheme is clarity and direction, and I think. I'm not sure if you want to know you're in Russia. You just want to know you can find your way.
But it is of a place, and that I thought in looking at it, it's really because you were balancing the square and the round in a way that gave that the specific character that makes it feel Moscow.
Well, that's
I mean,
right.
otherwise it would.
You could use Helvetica, yeah.
You might as well use Helvetica.
Well, absolutely, and that's what they did very early on, and they realized that this is not going to do the job for us. We need to commission this item as a bespoke item, and that's where we were brought in. I mean, yes, and that's why we did a lot of research, because I can sell you any font to any design scheme and tell you it's right, but that's not what I want to do. I want to sell you the right font. Well, ideally, I want to craft the right font for you and for your project, and that was our job very much here.
Yeah. So. When you showed the M that became sort of the emblem for the whole system,
Sure.
The way you described it, it just sort of seemed like, and then they need an M, so I worked this one out. I'm surprised that since that sort of was in effect the logo of the Metro, that people didn't get all complete. Like, I think people have trouble having opinions about fonts sometimes, but like my logo, people seem to get all agitated about that. Was that like a complicated part of the process? Because I think that's one of the most striking, interesting parts of the whole thing, that the M. Was it easy? Was it hard?
Well, to do a sans serif M?
Not for you to do it, but for you to talk about it with the client particularly, with the commission, not City ID, but the people in Moscow who sort of would.
Well, the good news is it's a good question, and the good news is that they actually have. I didn't show it in my presentation today, but they actually have a sans serif M that appears around the Metro also as a signifier. So they had the serif and the sans serif, but the serif is the oldest one and the one that's accepted. So there was a precedent for doing a sans serif M. Coming back to drawing an M, it's actually a very difficult letter to draw. So it's very difficult, and it took me a long time, because you think all the strokes are the same width, but they're not, and that's the difficulty. At the same time, it needs to look like uniform. But there's a lot of detail in it if you really zoom in as you start measuring.
And you had done that last, right? That was after you had drawn the font.
No, the M was always there.
The M was always there?
Well, I drew it very early on, yeah.
But when did they agree to it?
Well, the process was open with City ID all along, and when I said to them, listen, the serif font actually had the serif M, or a very close version of it, in it. And when they saw it, it's like, this is what we asked you to do, but it's actually not going to work, although it's a very beautiful. We all like serif fonts, right? I certainly do. But they could tell me it didn't work, so the argument was saying, well, there's another way of getting it in the font. They kind of, well, that makes perfect sense. Let's try it. It was very natural, and it kind of made itself in a way.
A couple questions from the audience. Come on. Yes, you have to yell it out, though.
How far along in the Cyrillic process did you draw before Ilya came in to start overseeing if it was right or not?
Yeah, I'll repeat that for for the videotape. How did you progress in drawing the Cyrillic characters, and how did you work with Ilya in terms of, was he involved from the start? Did you do some work, then did he come in?
Well, we had conversation very early on, and it was a conversation about what you do and what you don't. But it was very important for us to control the design process. So I drew the Cyrillic for all the early stages, just to see how would this font perform in Cyrillic also, because all the tests we were doing were dual language. They were in Russian and in Russian and Latin. So and when we kind of came to, there was no point in involving his expertise until we actually knew where we were going. So when we had the font we wanted to continue with, when the client made a decision, that's when the real the hard work and collaboration started with Ilya. But of course there were discussions all along, and he was, he would feed back to some of my stuff. But as I said earlier, the two scripts are, in my opinion, very closely related.
Had you spent a lot of time in Moscow before this project?
Not at all, no.
Yeah. Were you surprised? I mean, when you got the original commission, were you picturing something and then you went there and you were surprised by what you actually found, that it wasn't what you were imagining?
No, not really. I loved it, and I traveled quite a bit in China, and I'm not going to compare China to Russia, but it was natural for me to have a city with like a 10-lane motorway going straight through it. And it was natural because I've been to China, But for Scott Williams, that very much was part of this design process. It was wild for him, but I felt it was great for me. I felt at home, and I loved it. Well, absolutely.
And can you read Cyrillic?
Can you read Cyrillic now? You get any good at Russian?
Any better? Can you recognize words?
No, well, I can say thank you.
Well, I'll say thank you to Henrik. It was beautiful.